Hello, this is Phenomenology, and I'm Mark Thorsby. In this video, we'll be taking a look at Emmanuel Levinas's book, Totality and Infinity, which is an essay on exteriority. This is the second part of a video that began on Levinas's discussion of separation and discourse. We're going to start up with where we left off last time, which is, whoops, let me get it here, is number 5, Discourse and Ethics. Now, if you haven't watched the video, the previous video, you really should watch that before you jump into this. But suffice it to say, what we've discussed so far is Levinas articulates a conception of metaphysical separation between the other, and there is a relationship between the other that's given through the face and through speech and through language, because this is the primary means by which the other, the human other, expresses themselves. So we're talking about the way in which one expresses oneself as a way to thinking about language as the medium by which we can maintain the otherness or exteriority of the I and the other, right? So think about, for instance, when you meet someone, just in an ordinary common life, you meet someone, you don't really know who they are until they can express themselves. And you recognize the immanence of the other through their face, through the fact that they're a living, present being before you. So they're not given through history, they're not thematized. And in the previous section 4, because of the priority of language and the means by which language allows us to recognize the ethical domain that's opened up between ourselves and the other, it means that there can be inauthentic. He doesn't use that term inauthentic, so you shouldn't if you're talking about Levinas, but it sort of popped out. Inauthentic means of discourse where you you don't recognize the and you don't treat the other in an ethical sense. So this is when our discourse gets reduced to rhetoric, and so Levinas disagrees with that. He thinks rhetoric is a form of sophistry, can lead to things like pedagogy and teaching, and in that sense that's okay, but that's because they lead towards authentic discourse. But rhetoric, purely in and of itself, is a form of sophistry, power over another, where your goal is to force their will, force their freedom through persuasion and through any persuasive means possible, even ones which are not rational as such. And so he disagrees. He sees this as a type of violence. So at the very core of Levinas's discussion of ethics and language is the idea that discourse is central to ethics, because discourse is the means by which the other can express themselves, present themselves to us without our reducing them to some sort of concept. And let me also just say briefly that I think this is a very, very important topic for us to think about, particularly given the present political situation in the United States, in which we have, as it were, what do I want to say, a poverty of discourse, and we have an overwhelming surplus of rhetoric. And so I think this is very important, and Levinas has even discussed or referenced the political as such. So that's where we are, and that's where we're beginning now. Now, when we talk about language, that means that language institutes a relation irreducible to the subject-object relation, the revelation of the other. Um, so language institutes a relationship that can't be reduced to the subject-object relationship, that is part and parcel of our modern philosophical heritage, especially or particularly given Western philosophy, right? Ultimately, language institutes a relationship that's a revelation of the other, right? So revelation here. Now, I've done some work on my own separate research on a writer by the name of Walker Percy. And if you haven't read Walker Percy, you really should. He's a great Southern author that I don't think an American author from the South, who really, I think, adopts. I don't think he's thinking of Levinas. I don't even know if he read or knew of Levinas. But ultimately, his discussion about language as not being an economy of exchange, but rather as a third term, is very sort of interesting here. If you're interested in this, take a look at Walker Percy, and um, his book, The Last Self-Help Book, which is sort of interesting. It's sort of crazy book. But take a look at his work. But I was thinking about that, and this also relates to Peirce. So if you're interested in American philosophy, that might be someone worth thinking this, seeing I think maybe a parallel is in Charles Sanders Peirce's work, potentially. Not exactly, but there's an interesting symmetry between the two here, where they both see language as ultimately playing a third term to the communication is triadic, where you have the other, the I, and ultimately you have language as this mediating element here, one which preserves the alterity of each, but yet enables contact between both. So that means that the relations of language are primarily ethical. So when we say that ethics is first philosophy, the first concrete way in which we can see ethics concerns the way in which we speak. It concerns the speech we have with each other, in the way in which we receive the speech of others. So that's a key element here. And it's notable here that given, for instance, the biographical experience of Levinas in the Second World War and his proximity to the Holocaust, given those factors, it's clear here that you can see that there's an important ethics to think about when one should speak. Because I'm thinking here about how many people said nothing or recognized nothing, and were such that the Holocaust was able to occur. So I think there's some interesting ethical questions that are worth thinking through here in terms of their relevance with Levinas's discussion. Now, Levinas jumps into a discussion. I mean, he goes into more depth than I'm willing to do so here. But he starts talking about the Platonic Dialogues, and here it's interesting to think that, remember, Plato does write through dialogues, but more importantly, Plato thinks that the dialect itself is a way in which we can understand our ascent towards knowledge. And for Plato, that's knowledge of the forms and ultimately the form of the good as such. Right. So it's interesting here to think of Plato too also has a sort of first philosophy of ethics. Not exactly, but I think you could make some sort of hodgepodge argument to make that case. So there's an interesting Platonic relationship that Levinas is exploring, and he's quoting quite a bit from Plato as well. But what's the idea here is that when we talk about dialogues in Plato's sense, for Plato, dialogues are not the unfolding of a prefabricated internal logic, but the constitution of truth in a struggle between thinkers. I love this, with all the risk of freedom, right? And we're going to see that he's going to continue to talk about freedom. Freedom plays a really, really important role for thinking about the relationship between the self and the other. And by the way, I should say that I'm using the term self. This is not the term that Levinas uses, but I find it to be the most helpful way of description. I think the use of the term self is problematic because it means a specific thing for Levinas, but thinking about the same and the other. So with all the risk of freedom, right? And there is a way in which there's a struggle towards the truth when you're involved in a dialogue. I frequently remark to my students that dialogue is opposed to, or let's say discourse is opposed to debate. Right? Dialogue is opposed to debate. Debate, the goal is to win. That's rhetoric. That's the art of violence. Right? In discourse, the goal is to come to truth and to come to truth with another. And that's a very different operation. Now, in dialogue, we see the nudity of the face. That is, we see the fact that the other is who they are. And there's this great, it's sort of a long passage, and I know it's bad practice pedagogically to read these things to you, but take a look at what he says, Levinas. He says, things are naked by metaphor only when they are without adornments, like bare walls and naked landscapes. They have no need of adornment when they are absorbed in the accomplishment of the function for which they are made, when they are subordinated to their own finality so radically that they disappear in it. Right? What a beautiful description. He continues, they disappear beneath their form. The perception of individual things is the fact that they are not entirely absorbed in their form. They then stand out in themselves, breaking through, rendering their forms, and not resolved into the relations that link them up to the totality. They are always in some respect like those industrial cities whose everything is adapted to a goal of production, but which full of smoke, full of waste and sadness, exist also for themselves. For a thing, nudity is the surplus of its being over its finality. So this is what nudity is. And this is the way in which the exteriority of the other, through their expression and through dialogue, through the struggle, right? It's the way in which the other reveals themselves for who and what they are, right? It's, by the way, it's one of the risks one has in having a dialogue is the fact that you open yourself up, isn't it? Isn't this why people are afraid to raise their hand and ask questions in class? It's because one becomes nude when one puts word to their face, right? When one speaks in authentic sort of dialogue, that is when someone is most nude. But it's a surplus of their finality, right? They're more than what they seem. They're more than what. No, not. Let me say that. They're more than what they appear, right? Whoa. So he says, for instance, so thus the Platonic conception of the intelligible sun situated outside of the eye that sees and the object it illuminates describes with precision the perception of things, right? It's almost as if Levinas is articulating a phenomenological Neoplatonism. Now, I hate to say that because that's really bad, but I only mean that in the sense that it's a radical. The Levinas gives us a radical departure of Plato, but Levinas himself recognizes that Plato has a desperate affinity for describing the truth of things and taking exteriority seriously, or at least taking dialogue seriously. Right. Now, okay, when we talk about the nudity of the face, what we're talking about is the nudity of the face is equal to the ideas that it is itself without reference to a system. So that's what it means to say that we can't thematize or totalize the other when they're nude, right? When they are before us in their speech, right? And he says the relationship with the face is not an object cognition. Now, an object cognition is really the language of talking about Husserl here. And Husserl is saying that in language we identify eidetic correlates, and you'll remember the whole schema, really, that Husserl sets up. But this is not the relationship with the face that he's describing here. It's not an object cognition, right? That's to talk about the face as a relationship in terms of an object cognition is precisely not to recognize the nudity, the surplus of the other's exteriority, right? So what we have here is we have a relationship that goes beyond mere rhetoric, right? Mere rhetoric is about persuading people to agree to some sort of thing, but in the persuasion, one is treated as an object cognition, right? You treat the other as someone who thinks this, right? You can say, oh, they're an anti-abortionist, right? Once we begin to treat the other in our dialogue as an object cognition, as a theme, right, as a historical moment, right? Once we begin to do that, we actually enter into a form of injustice. We enter into an existential of rhetoric, and so that's. You can sort of see here how I think really in many ways he's on to really a great description of what it really is like to be in dialogue with other people, right? He says the nakedness of the face is destituteness, right? Levinas, I think maybe personally, critically, I think he overemphasizes the sort of way in which I think he overemphasizes his language frequently with these sorts of words, right? But he argues that the nakedness of the face is destituteness, right? They're delivered over to you, right? To recognize the other is to recognize a hunger. To recognize the other is to give, but it is to give to the Master, to the Lord, to him who approaches as you in a dimension of height, right? So here and again, you can see that Levinas is putting together the asymmetry of the self with this articulation of dialogue. Now, the presence of the other, ultimately, what it does is it calls into question our enjoyment of the world, and this engages us into a recognition of generosity towards the other. Think about, for instance, when you walk in the mall, and as you're walking, I've given this example before in other videos, but as you're walking in the mall, you see the prices of things and this sort of things, and you have no problem with the products you're buying. But imagine, for instance, if you had to see the pictures of the workers in the third world, or in the undeveloped world rather, who are forced to labor and to make these goods to you, right? Most people would suddenly think, well, is this the store that I want to shop in, perhaps, right? And this, what it does is when we see the face of the other, right, this calls into question our enjoyment of the world, the way in which we can have desire and enjoy ourselves in the world, right? But when I see the face of the other and I recognize this hunger, right, and I reckon this in this asymmetrical way, right, it calls into question my own egoistic enjoyment, and this is ultimately what gives way to a potential for generosity towards the other, right? To speak is to make, when one speaks, to speak is to make the world common, to create common places. Language does not refer to the generality of concepts, but lays the foundation for a possession in common. It abolishes the inalienable property of enjoyment. The world in discourse is no longer what it is in separation, right? Um, and we keep going, but I'll stop there. So you can see here that language and discourse in the face come together in a way which really does have an ethical dimension. But it's important, Levinas says, that we have to remember that discourse is not love, right? He says we can still reject the other, right? We can still reject the other, and we can, so to have dialogue with another is not love. Now, this might be important for thinking in politics and thinking about the ways in which um, um, you can come together and have discourse with your enemy, right? How that's possible. It's possible because it's fundamentally a macrocosm of what we do in the micro level, at an individual level, when we recognize and talk to each other and have a discourse with each other, right? Okay, so that is, when we talk about discourse and ethics, that's his view. Now, ultimately, for Levinas, it's important that we remember that this is a metaphysical relationship. So he says, let's quickly talk about the metaphysical and the human, and remember that this ethical relationship is a metaphysical relation here, right? Remember, this is not a practical ethics as such, though I've been drawing a lot of sort of kind of concrete illustrations, right? Well, the ethical relation, so we're talking about here is the ethical relation as an atheist to the world is one without a violence of the sacred, right? So here's an important thing is that as an atheist, as this egoistic entity, remember, atheist has this special connotation for him. That means that to live in that world is not to do violence to that which is sacred to the other, right? And so there's an interesting conception of the sacred here, which I won't talk about, but it's worth thinking through and following through in your own research. There's also, on 77, we have this quote: the idea of infinity, the metaphysical relation, is the dawn of a humanity without myths. Because myths, right, are fundamentally what enable us to sort of create ethical systems that are ingrained into our social operations. Or that sounds a little cold, into our social fabric, let's say, right? But you see, the idea of infinity gives us a possibility for having a humanity, a relationship with others and with each other that is not driven and organized by mythology, right? Which is important because not that mythology should be rejected, but that mythology ultimately um, wants to totalize the other too. That's the ultimate problem with mythology. So if you don't agree with my mythology, right? Let's say you're a Taoist and I'm a Muslim, right? If you don't agree, depending on who it is, right? If you don't agree with my mythology, I'm tempted to totalize you into a theme, right? And to think of you as a heretic, perhaps, or an infidel, for instance. So that's a way in which you can see here that he has a different conception. Now, atheism conditions one's relationship with God. So he goes into a discussion about God here, and he says, remember here he's Jewish and he's a teacher of the Torah, and of course for him the monotheistic faith presupposes this metaphysical atheism. Not the other way around. So he thinks that monotheistic faith, what she thinks is the more perfect form of faith, right? monotheistic faith presupposes this structural condition of atheism for the self, right? And so what that means is that the dimension of the divine also opens forth from the human face. So you can see here Levinas is really going quite metaphysical, and also saying on top of his thesis about the ethical relationships we have with other people, in terms of it's through the other person, that we recognize the divine. And here I can't help but think about someone like Mother Teresa, who gave her life's work to serve the poor, to serve the other, right? And to take seriously the other without trying to convert them, though that was welcome, right? And to do that, and that was the way in which she had a relationship with God. So I think that's quite interesting, in fact. So what does this mean at the end of the day? It means that ethics is first philosophy, right? He says the atheism of the metaphysician means, positively, that our relationship with the metaphysical is an ethical behavior and not theology, not a thematization, right? So this is an important thing, right? Metaphysics is enacted where the social relation is enacted. So wherever there's society, wherever there's people with each other, wherever the other I relationship can exist, right? That's where metaphysics gets enacted. And that's also where ethics begins, right? So social relations actually ground his theological relations for Levinas. Um, Quite interesting, especially if you're an atheist, right? The establishing of this primacy of the ethical, that is the relationship of man to man, signification, teaching, and justice, a primacy of an irreducible structure upon which all other structures rest, right? That ultimately is the goal of this book, is to articulate that structure. And that primacy of the structure here is given in this sort of atheistic dimension. I feel like I'm just reading to you lots of text now, so I'll try to keep this to a minimum. Um, but I'll leave you with this one as well. Is that everything that cannot be reduced to an interhuman relation represents not the superior form, but the forever primitive form of religion. So for all of you people out there who are interested in religious studies and theology, this is quite interesting, right? So everything that cannot be reduced to interhuman relationships is primitive religion for him. So that means that, and I'm going to hypothesize and expound beyond what Levinas says, so you can critique me. I probably am wrong, right? But think about, for instance, the way in Christianity, for instance, think about the way in which there's an emphasis in the Gospels about helping the other person, right? That's the whole mission of Jesus of Nazareth, right? Is to help other people, right? And that's the gift of grace, right? The gift of grace is not a political gift; it's a gift of the other being respected at an individual level, right? So that's one way of thinking about it. But you could say that for him, then, anything that can't be reduced to this relationship between the other, because ultimately these other structural reasons, would mean that those are primitive forms of religion. So, for instance, the emphasis on, I think, and this is where I think a lot of people will disagree with me since I'm going up against a whole doctrine, is to think about the Trinity for the Christian, or at least the classic Christian, right? The God is three persons but one, right? God is three in one. And that ultimately is trying to describe, that doctrine is trying to describe what God is as such. And the question can that be reduced to an interhuman relation? Now, it is interesting that the Trinity represents an interdivine relation. So there's a whole avenue of ways of thinking about this. And it's worth thinking and remembering here that Levinas was in dialogue, especially with Catholic phenomenologists who are thinking of very similar issues. But for Levinas, at least, anything that can't be reduced to this interhuman relationship, that's grounded in an atheism, he calls it, right? This is ultimately a primitive form of religion. So it's quite interesting. So that's sort of an aside. Let's move now to the face-to-face. The face-to-face is an irreducible relation for Levinas. It's irreducible because, number one, it's the infinity of the other in us. So it's an infinity in us. So infinities cannot be reduced, right? Just remember that. And this occurs, or this is brought about through discourse. And this is what reveals us this ethical relation. Now, it's important to remember that the conjunction of the same and the other is not the face-to-face relationship. So when we talk about the face-to-face relationship, we're not talking about just the idea that there's a one being and then here's another and then here's just them together. Here's the same and here's the other and here they're conjoined. That's not the relationship we're talking about. Um, the face-to-face relationship has this asymmetrical relationship, and Levinas calls it the ultimate situation, right? It's the ultimate situation for him. Okay, so we're going to sort of move there, and that is the end of that second section B on separation and discourse, and it really, for me, forms the heart of Levinas's work in Totality and Infinity. I think that for my reading, this discussion of discourse and ethics is really, really key. Now Levinas moves on in section C to talk about truth and justice. And he's already talked about truth previously, but we're going to see him raising a number of interesting questions. Number one, this relationship is one in which freedom gets called into question, right? And here we can ask, what is the relationship between justice and truth? One moment. Truth is not separable from intelligibility, right? Truth is not separable from intelligibility, because in order to know that something is truth, you have to understand what it is that's true, right? So truth and intelligibility, they're not the same thing, but they always accompany each other, right? Or at least they should in principle, right? And that means that to know is to comprehend something, and that means that the concern for intelligibility signifies a respect for objects, right? It signifies a concern for the way things are in the world, right? And here we have to remember that theory requires a suspension of action, and a suspension of action requires a reserve of freedom, right? So when you go into the question of what's true and you begin to theorize about things and you create objective forms of those theories, right? Think here about any theory you've ever heard of or read or understood, right? Especially theories of social science and psychology, right? And also physics, right? All of these are a concern for the intelligibility, and that's a respect for the way the world is, right? And that means that we suspend action when we're doing theory. And this is a suspension of action requires our freedom to suspend our action, right? So theory is the attitude of a being that can disrupt itself. And self-criticism, right, critique, it actually means that it requires the discovery of one's own unworthiness. That is, one cannot critique things and engage in theory unless they first recognize that they themselves can be wrong, right? And when they recognize their own unworthiness as such, that enables a freedom where we suspend action and then think about how things really are. Think about if you have a false theory, for instance. You think that something causes cancer when something else doesn't, right? You only will start to theorize when you realize that, number one, you don't understand what causes cancer or something like this. So this is interesting asymmetry. He's trying to explore the way in which this asymmetry has ramifications towards our concern for objective knowledge, right? He says, from failure alone would come the necessity of curbing violence and in introducing order into human relations. Political theory derives justice from the undisclosed value of spontaneity. Political theory, I feel like, hold on a minute. Yep, that's right, okay. I apologize. I thought this was in a different section. Political theory derives justice from the undiscussed value of spontaneity. Its problem is to ensure, by way of knowledge of the world, the most complete exercise of spontaneity by reconciling my freedom with the freedom of others. So here we suddenly have a vision here of what Levinas thinks political theory is about. So theory is about trying to maintain my freedom and the freedom of others, right? And that's ultimately what political theory is about. But it too proceeds from, both in content and in form, from a first primary recognition of the other's alterity. So the consciousness of our unworthiness is not the result of knowing facts, but it's ultimately a result of our encounter with the other. So, and this is important, right? One doesn't understand that they've made an ill mistake in politics unless things go wrong with actual people, right? It's not the concepts, the theory can be laid out, right? But ultimately, our unworthiness is based on our existential way of living with each other, right? So the idea of totality and infinity differ precisely in that the first is purely theoretical, while the second is moral. And so finally, we have really one of our first big answers to the question of the whole book. What's the book about? Well, in many ways, totality and infinity, it could be subtitled theoretical and moral, theory and morality, right? Uh, it doesn't really work there because it sounds like a system of theories, right? Because it's an existential claim. But you can see this is a totality is when I turn someone else, when I totalize the other, is when I put them into a purely theoretical mode. That's what totality is. Okay, so it's not necessary to have the idea of infinity, the idea of the perfect, as Descartes thought in his third meditation, right? He thinks that the infinity is accomplished. I recognize the infinity of the other, and this is accomplished in shame. There's another negative characterization of our ethical relation. It's accomplished in shame where freedom at the same time is discovered in the consciousness of shame and is concealed in the shame itself, right? So morality begins with our freedom in recognition of this shame, right? Or morality begins with the face, but this is how the moral theoretics begin, right? So number two, the investiture of freedom or critique. Now, Levinas goes on to argue that existence does not consist in being condemned to freedom, like Sartre thought, right? And if you haven't taken a look at, take a look at Sartre's work, Being and Nothingness, in which he talks about the idea that existence is about being and nothingness, and that I think I was sorry when he argues that existence ultimately. Our form of existence is one in which we're condemned to be free. We have no choice but to be free. Levinas doesn't agree with this, right? He thinks that he has a different position for freedom in his phenomenology. He argues that existence is our investment in freedom. It's the way we get invested in the way in which we are free to act. So there's a different conception, I think a more moderate conception than Sartre's. Right, he says to philosophy, and then here he starts thinking about philosophy. With some great passages from Levinas about the history of philosophy. I'm gonna one. Okay, so remember we've been talking about moral theory. Sorry, I had to pause the video for a second. So Levinas says on 84, to philosophize is to actually to trace freedom back to what lies before it, right? So when we engage in critique in theory, remember that all this happens through language, right? When we do philosophy, what we're doing is we're tracing freedom back to what came before, right? And he says to liberate freedom from the arbitrary. That's what philosophy's goal is to liberate our freedom from just what's arbitrary or what's dogmatically given, right? Now he says critique ultimately is the essence of knowing, right? Critique or philosophy is the essence of knowing. And he characterizes this as a way of taking charge. So his understanding is that philosophy is a free activity. And here think about how Aristotle talks about the idea that philosophy begins in leisure. You have to have freedom, right? And that this is the essence of knowing is critique. And this is like taking charge, or is a form of taking charge, as it were. Let me move to the next one. Now, critique cannot be a form of existing that's grounded on objective knowledge, though, right? Why does he argue this? Well, he says that the knowing whose essence is critique leads to the other. To welcome the other is to put in question my freedom, right? So the knowing whose essence is critique leads to the other. So for him, philosophy is a metaphysical activity in which ultimately it's about the metaphysics we have with the other. Okay. Now, when we think of critique, what is critique? He says on 86, critique is the awakening of an existence that takes charge of its own condition, but this awakening comes from the other, right? Because the other alone eludes thematization. Right, to thematize is to put someone, to give a label, right? So for instance, if you see like I remember years ago, when I first went to the Great Britain, I was in the United Kingdom, I was talking to someone about Wales, and they said something derogatory about the Welsh, right? And that person was thematizing people who live in a certain spot in the country. And that's not to say that there isn't such a thing as Welsh people, but it's to say that to thematize the other is to reduce the other to an object, right? Is to theorize, is to totalize, right? And so the other eludes this thematization, right? And thematization can't serve to found thematization, right? So the welcoming of the other is ipso facto the consciousness of my own injustice, the shame that freedom feels for itself. So you have a very sort of nuanced, and I think in what would, from a conventional sense, appear to be an inverted conception of my relationship to that and the way in which the other organizes me. So even though I have this atheistic, egoistic core, the other completely overrides it, right? So that's what, by the way, what I think Levinas would say if someone said, "Well, what would Levinas say to the egoist who thinks that their conception of self-interest should override others?" I think Levinas would say, "Yeah, that there is a way in which we can be egoists, but the only way that form of egoism can function, think of Ayn Rand here, the only way it can function is to thematize the other, to reduce the other into an economic, ironically, calculus, right? So that means that what all of this is missing is the dimension of height, the way in which we've tried to illustrate it in terms of the other stands before me, over me, as a surplus of their own freedom, right? And this initializes my freedom. So freedom is the imperialism of the same, right? My freedom is to be in charge of myself, right? So freedom is the imperialism of my own totality. Now, but I don't really have access to it, right? He says freedom can reduce infinity to a totality, right? So this is why the way in which we're able to reject the other in the worst form would be to thematize the other as an object, right? And the history of philosophy attests to this, where the relation of the same to other gets reduced to a universal order. So Levinas here gives a number of critical comments where he thinks that the history of theory, of philosophical theory, has been one in which the goal has been to reduce this into some sort of universal totality. And here Hegel is a good example. Think of Hegel's philosophy of history, and it's the absolute conception of the philosophy of history that Hegel gives, right? Levinas adds, philosophy itself is identified with the substitution of ideas for persons. The themes for the interlocutor, the interiority of the logical relation for the exteriority of interpolation, existence are reduced to the neuter state of the idea being the concept, right? So you can see here is that philosophy has this temptation to totalize. And that's a really sort of important thing. We have to remember this dimension of height, which actually is what activates critique in the first place. That seems to be his argument. So that means that the presence of the other does not clash with freedom, but actually invest in it, right? So remember, the freedom is the imperialism of the same. So the presence of the other doesn't destroy my freedom, right? They actually are an investment in my freedom. That's why he says that the other, or it's the way by which the other can activate my freedom of critique and suspend my action, etc., etc. Right? And that means that ultimately he's in radical opposition to Heidegger here. And Levinas takes a moment in the text to actually emphasize that means that the other cannot be subordinate to ontology. Remember, because now he's created a limiting factor for philosophy itself, critique itself. And Heidegger, right, invests his entire project in trying to articulate the Seinsfrage, or trying to articulate a response or an answer to the question of being, what being is as such. And for Heidegger, the only way we can do that is first to understand Dasein, the being for whom being is an issue. But for him, Dasein is a subordinate object to being as such. Now, I don't know if Heidegger would characterize it the way I have, but I get the feeling that's the way Levinas sees it. And that means that the other, for Heidegger, gets reduced to this ontological domain, right? This is why Levinas is emphasizing the resurgence of metaphysics here. And because ultimately, if Heidegger does this, then you can see here that Heidegger has a fundamental, now he falls within the general framework of the history of philosophy, finding a universal order, which Heidegger would hate. But in addition to that, ultimately Heidegger's exploration of Dasein is premised upon an unethical operation. Now, of course, you could say that about a lot of other philosophers too. Now, let's moving on. Truth presupposes justice. And here, Levinas does some interesting things. And I'll be honest, I'm not fully sure I understand the full scope of his argument. So some of you may, and I encourage you to read this on your own. Where he talks about the anarchy of the spectacle and the evil genius. And he talks about the idea that, well, let's just take a look at I pulled 3 key passages. He says, but a world that's absolutely silent, that would not come to us from the word, right, from the speech of the other, be it mendacious, would be an anarchic, that is, without principle, without a beginning. Phenomena would degrade into appearance. So here it seems to be the case that Levinas is saying that if we just had a situation where there was no other, and there was no this ethical relation didn't exist, this asymmetry, and we had a world that was silent, as it were, right? A world that didn't express itself, right? We lived in a world where there was no expression to us. Then that means our phenomena would get reduced to appearances. We would actually lose what some would call our objectivity, right? The possibility of having knowledge of the world. We lose the possibility of truth. It's notable that pretty much every philosopher, from Husserl to Karl Popper, who talks about inner subjectivity, talks about the idea that inner subjectivity is the basis of objectivity. And consider the fact that you don't think that let's say, everyone experiences the world and they believe that what's happening to them is really happening. Why? Well, one is because we have concepts for the world. Now, our concepts for the world depend upon our agreement in our communication, right? So for instance, if suddenly you start using a different word to talk about something that I talk about, but you do this in a way that reorganizes the whole language, right? Then that means I lose my ability to understand my world in a way that you would agree with, which means that I suddenly find myself in a position of solipsism, where I'm all alone, right? And this would mean that all of my experiences, my phenomena, the meaning of what I think I am experiencing gets reduced to just pure appearance. And this sounds very similar to Descartes' evil genius, where Descartes has all these experiences in the first meditation, but Descartes is not sure that they're absolutely real, right? So you can see here that without this ethical relation with the other, Levinas is arguing that we would fall into the first Cartesian meditation, right? He says, in the second quote here, he to whom the real had just presented itself with an appearance that shone forth as the very skin of being is being made game of, right? That is, we turn our reality into a mere game, right? If we treat what we're experiencing as just the skin. But here's the idea: is that what gives us more. What makes the appearance go to being a phenomenon? It is my communication with the other. It's the language I have with the other. Which, by the way, remember, all of us, each one of us, has a language that was inherited to them. Right? No one creates their own language. Even Wittgenstein has agreed with this idea. Right? And because of that, right, that means that the other plays a really critical role. And for Levinas, a metaphysical role. Right? And then finally he says, the silent world is a world that comes to us from the other. But he, an evil genius, its equivocation is insinuated in a mockery. Thus silence is not a simple absence of speech. Right? So what does he mean by silence? Speech lies in the depths of silence like a laughter, perfidiously held back. It is the inverse of language. The interlocutor has given a sign, but has declined every interpretation. This is the silence that terrifies. Speech consists in the other coming to the assistance of the sign given forth, attending his own most manifestation in signs, redressing the equivocal by this attendance. So interesting, we have now a phenomenology not of the way in which one speaks, and the idea of speech is a giving to the sign that one gives, right, making that connection, right? But on the other hand, we have a conception of phenomenological silence, one in which the other declines and resists every form of interpretation, right? This is ultimately what speech is, a resistance of interpretation. So when the other is reduced to a mere spectacle, then what you have is a state of anarchy. You can see here, so this is the contradistinction to what the goal of the political is, right? It is to arrest precisely that. Now, I'm fairly quick here. We're running low on time, so I'm going to sort of move through these a little bit more quickly. Levinas then moves to the discussion of expression. And for him, expression is the key principle here, because the other is the principle of phenomena. So this is an important phenomenological point, since this is a phenomenology course, is that for Levinas, the other is the principle by which I recognize the phenomena. And I agree with that wholeheartedly. I think that he's absolutely right here. You don't have to agree with me, but I love his articulation of this. Now he talks about the cogito and the other, right? The self, the I think, and the other. I think that's my mistake. Here we go. Right. Descartes' cogito, right? Descartes' cogito, I think, therefore I am, and that's I think I exist, right? Gives Descartes this first certitude, but Levinas thinks that there's something that's arbitrary there, right? Why does he stop there? Shouldn't, in fact, Levinas say that, shouldn't he first understand the evidence of what a doubt is before he engages in all of this? And he says, well, Descartes seeks a certitude, but he stops at the first level, the change of level, in this vertiginous descent. In fact, he possesses the idea of infinity and can gauge in advance the return of affirmation behind the negation. But to possess the idea of infinity is to have already welcomed the other. And this is actually, basically, I had similar, not that I'm nearly as intelligent or insightful as Levinas here, but I've had a similar insight when I first read Descartes, which is, how come Descartes never doubts the language with which he's doubting, right? He says, I will doubt all things that I can, so he doubts the existence of his body, all these things. He doubts his own existence, but he never doubts his own language. And this is what Levinas is pointing to, I think, the idea that my language is given from another, right? And that is an infinite relationship. And that's a relationship of debt, ultimately, that I have to the other, right? Okay. For some reason, this thing wants to go there. Okay. So now moving here along to Levinas's discussion of objectivity and language. Right, and here he's sort of kind of, I think in many ways, tying up some loose ends, right? He says the silent world is anarchic, okay. And that knowing, and if you had an anarchic world, knowledge wouldn't be possible. And this is really the sort of evil genius problem that we've been talking about, right? So on 93, he says, objectivity where being is proposed to consciousness is not a residuum of finality. There's a spelling error there. It should be a residue, or I'm sorry, residue. Right? Objectivity is not a residue of finality, right? So objectivity is not this totalizing factor. Right? I apologize, the sun's coming in through the blinds. The objectivity of the object and its signification comes from language, right? And here that means that we're always talking about meaning. In objectivity, always comes in the form of language, where we have signs and signifiers. And we won't get into the discussion here because there's a lot of interesting things to think about when we start talking about signs and signifiers. You can also see we're very close, and really our next philosopher here, if we're going to continue, should be Derrida, right? But what else does he say? It says signification or intelligibility does not arise from the identity of the same, who remains in himself, but from the face of the other, who calls upon the same. Signification is the absolute surplus of the other with respect to the same who desires him, who desires what he does not lack, who welcomes the other across themes. I apologize, there's a couple of sort of mistakes there. So you can see for Levinas, the other is ultimately the source of signification, almost in a primordial sense, because the significations of beings is manifested not in the perspective of finality, but in that of language. There's an interesting comment that Nietzsche has. One of my colleagues is frequent to remind me that there's a question, there's a point where Nietzsche says, at the end, the only thing that could be metaphysical is language. And here, I think we would hear Levinas say, that's right, that's absolutely right, right? Now, what speech does is speech introduces a principle into this anarchy. Now, remember, as a principle, the principle is the means by which the anarchy is organized, right? So the organization itself is not going to be an organization of speech, right? Because speech is that which does the organizing, right? Of objectivity, right? Language is not one modality of symbolism. Every symbolism refers already to a language, right? And so here, this is, of course, recalls the famous problem of logisticism um, during the early 19th century, I'm sorry, the late 19th century and the early 20th century, the tendency to think of language as merely just a system of symbols or some sort of systemization. And here the idea is one can never capture language in terms of a purely formal system, because to do that is to take away the other. And if you take away the other, you take away the primordial ground for language itself. And this is why you probably, I think you get Wittgenstein in the latter investigations arguing that at the end of the day, language is grounded upon our forms of life. What is the key form of life we have? Well, a key form of life is our relationship we have with each other, right? So this moves us here now to the question of language and attention, right? The way in which language calls our attention to it, right? He says speech is a teaching, right? Speech is when the other, and it's a teaching in the sense that speech is when the other teaches us who they are through their expression, right? So there's a pedagogical, I don't want to say pedagogical, but there is a sort of pedagogical, formally pedagogical way in which speech itself always is a form of teaching, right? And you can see here about the ethics of speech may come in, for instance. Speech first founds the community by giving, right? And it gives the other to another, right? It gives the others to each other in these asymmetrical relations. And an utterance, now speech is this sort of formal way of talking about, I think, the imminent occurrence of the face in language. An utterance is the particularity of it, right? An utterance is when the apparition loses its phenomenality in being fixed as a theme. So as soon as my utterance is understood, then that means that who I am, the ghost of who you think I am, or maybe you've thematized me into one thing or another, that gets lost phenomenally, right? You've probably had this experience if you've ever met someone who is very different than you, and you met them and you had preconceived ideas about who they are because they were maybe they were this ethnicity or something or other, right? And then after you got to know them, suddenly all of those themes just vanish, and they vanish through the utterance of the other, right? That is, the presence of the other dispels the anarchic sorcery of the facts, right? The world can become an object. So it calls our attention. He says, thematization as the work of language, as an action exercised by the master on me, is not a mysterious information, but the appeal addressed to my attention. So there's I'm slightly uncomfortable with the way Levinas is describing this, but he starts to describe the other as being a master, right? Because he's trying to inculcate this vocabulary of the relationship. I don't really like his language of master here, but this is the language he's using, right? And he says that the master addresses them, they thematize towards me, in fact, right? And they do this by appealing to my attention. Attention is attention to something because it is an attention to someone, right? The other is the key. The exteriority of its point of departure is essential to it. It is the very tension of the I, right? So the tension of the I in the I think and in the my I and you relationship, ultimately it's the exteriority and I attend to you because of that exterior relationship. So let's move here to language and justice. What does this mean for language and justice? Well, it means that the other uses language and they announce the thematization of phenomena, right? So I'm somewhere and another calls it a word and I start using that word to refer to that thing, right? Notice, right? And the other resists the thematization, right? They announce the thematization, right? He says the presence of the master who by his word gives gives meaning to phenomena and permits them to be thematized, is not open to an objective knowing. This presence is in society with me. So it's a social function. And I think in many ways he's describing what we might call the intersubjective, what I would call, and I do call the intersubjective framework. Now, what this means is that my freedom doesn't have the last word, though, because I'm not alone, right? So that's why I can't just stick with my atheistic egoism, right? He says the moral relationship with the master who judges me subtends the freedom of my adherence to the truth. Thus, language commences. So what this means is that the utterance of the other thematizes that of the truth. And accordingly, my moral relationship begins there in language. Now, we have this communication of idea, the reciprocity of dialogue already hide the profound essence of language. So to think of language as a communication, as reciprocal dialogue, right, is already to misunderstand the very essence of language as heterogeneous towards the other, right? He says, and here is he's directly thinking in this passage, finally, of Martin Buber's I-thou relationship. We haven't talked about it. I'll leave it to you to take a look at. He says the interlocutor is not a thou. He is a you, right? Now, as you can see, he reveals himself in his lordship. Thus, exteriority coincides with the mastery. My freedom is thus challenged by a master who can invest in it. Truth, the sovereign exercise of freedom, henceforth becomes possible. So it's the ethical relationship itself that is the ground. So, okay, there's where all that was. It's the ethics which is ultimately the ground for our conception of truth, because that's the means by which language is given. Language is being given through the other. Whoops, sorry. In this last section, I'm going to keep it real brief since we only got a couple moments left. And it also, Levinas only talks about this very shortly. He talks about separation and absoluteness. So we have to remember that we have separation between ourselves and the other, but that the separation is absolute. Why is this doing this? Okay, hold on. My apologies. Somehow my presentation's gone crazy on me. Let's see if this works. The concrete form of the relation is society. So when we ask the question, what is society? Well, society is the concretization of the totality infinity relationship, right? He says the same and the other, right, remain absolutely separated. The idea of infinity requires this separation, right? We discussed that. So society accomplishes it concretely, right? So society is the concretization of the infinity of the other. And here he goes into a long discussion of the ancient privilege of unity that we see in, for instance, Parmenides, Spinoza, and Hegel. And he says that ultimately the tendency to try to unify metaphysical reality and deny the infinity of the other and to create just one monistic sort of system, he said is rooted in really just missing the dichotomy. Not recognizing that there's two types of separation. On the one hand, there's separations of need, right? Things that have to be separated by necessity. And he thinks that this is where the pre-Socratic and Hegel and Spinoza go wrong, as well as the other philosophers, is that there is a separation, but it's not a separation of necessity, right? There's also separation of desire, right? And the separation of desire aims towards the good, right? And this is related to our egoistic, atheistic movement towards enjoyment, right? But he says that all of these philosophers only think the only form of metaphysical separation is the separation of necessity. And of course, if there's a different form of separation, we can articulate a different conception. And it's out of desire ultimately that's the key for him. He says, actually, I'm going to read this a little bit further. He says, the ontology of human existence, philosophical anthropology, endlessly paraphrases this abstract thought by insisting with pathos on finitude, right? So ontology of human existence emphasis is moving towards the finitude, towards totality. But he says, in reality, what is at issue is an order where the very notion of the good first takes on meaning. What is at issue is society. So ultimately, to say that this is where to his metaphysical thesis, the idea that ethics is first philosophy in terms of our relationship with the other, means that we're talking about the concrete ways in which society unfolds and the way in which society allows the other to exist. Right? It says here the relation connects not terms that complete one another and consequently are reciprocally lacking to one another, but terms that suffice to themselves. This relation is desire, the life of beings that have arrived at self-possession. Infinity thought concretely, that is starting with the separated being, turns towards it, surpasses itself. He's linking up again. Somehow I really screwed those up. He's linking again this notion of the concretization towards the political, right? He says, infinity withstands the invasion of totality, and it allows for the place of separated beings, right? So infinity becomes a really critical concept here, right? And I've said this over and over, but it's critical because it's the means by which we can understand these two forms of separation, right? He says, infinity opens the order of the good. Infinity opens the order of the good. The distinction between need and desire cannot be reflected in formal logic, where desire is always forced into the forms of need. From this purely formal necessity comes the force of Parmenidean philosophy, right? But here's the problem, is that separation is not a simple form of negation or privation. And because of that, Levinas thinks that his metaphysical thesis here can overcome, which would be the severe criticism of someone like Parmenides or Hegel, right? He says that, quote, thought and freedom come to us from separation and from the consideration of the other. Again, the priority of the other is absolutely essential. And with that, we're going to conclude the video. This has been the second part of our second. Well, anyway, this is our fourth video on Levinas, the second part from the last video, where we looked at separation and discourse. Now we've looked at truth and justice, and also separation and absoluteness. This has been Totality and Infinity. There's a lot more to talk about here with Levinas, and we're going to have one more video on Levinas coming up. And unfortunately, that's all. That'll conclude our phenomenology series for this semester. So take a look, and I look forward to seeing you online for our next video. Thanks again. Talk to you later.